I'll change that now. It's kind of stiff.
Friday?
Hi.
Tomorrow?
Yeah.
Fall cars all the rage.
Oh, I know. I couldn't believe it. I got it at Facebook. I had bought one at Toy Guards.
Yeah.
For like, I can try it.
For Toy Guards prices.
For Toy Guards. But I had so much fun. I think I touched every single hat.
Perfect. 3 touches.
I know. Especially when I returned their hat.
Trying to buy something or not come?
No, I'm just-
Shoot.
It's like Jimmy John's, free smells.
What are you doing here? Oh, hey.
I just thought, because
Hi there.
Hello.
they're really
I've got Bible, so.
Hi. You need it right away? Charming Charlie are going out of business and,
I
well,
know, you look.
they're closing. I haven't shopped there in a long time, but I was shopping for my niece. Hello again. And everything is 40 to 60% off.
Oh, that's
right. Sorry, I gotta grab one.
Back row claim first.
I know, I was like, look at these little friends here.
Well, we gotta go to worship, so.
Yeah, so I picked myself up a couple things. All this Christmas shopping. One for you, one for me, one for you, one for me.
Oh,
Yeah, that works. Well, you know, there's only so many, like, maternity things I want to buy for, like, for Christmas and whatever. Like,
Where are you guys going?
I can order this after I'm done being pregnant.
There you go.
Just buy yards of work.
It's not quite started yet, but it'll start.
Very
Hey,
versatile.
Danica,
Yeah,
do you want people to sign
that
up?
would be great.
Okay, I'll pass them around.
And I've started the video camera and I'll be.
You started it?
Yeah, just because I was gonna leave.
Do I need to aim? Oh.
It's the whole front, so
Okay, sign it.
I knew you were a wonderer, so I put it over there.
Not when I preach, but when I teach.
I know, that's good. I have two, so. Do you want?
New?
What?
These are discussions.
What do you want to say? Uh-huh.
Did Bruce grab a sheet from
Oh, you know what, do you need? I want
Yeah, I'll
this.
grab one. Thanks.
Two-sided.
Perfect. Do you have an electronic copy of this?
Yes.
If you'd send it to me, then I can just email it to
I
everyone.
will try to
I got
remember.
4 emails in the last half hour of people who are sick, so it might be slim pickings tonight.
Something going around. Oh, it's great. I watched it and sent it to both of my daughters already.
Turned out great. Last night, I'm like, oh, in Georgia. Can you help me with one last thing? We're trying to make the video. Could you please make a Snapchat?
It's so cool. We should shut them here. Could we? How? Because not everybody's here for a lot of Christmas.
Right.
Well, you know what we should put on the website?
It'll go on the e-news and on the website.
And,
Yeah.
and, okay,
So,
after Christmas.
yeah, yeah. You'll see it.
Well, you know what I did?
Yeah, you can make a payment at any time online. So 45 is what I had covered up application. So, fundraiser is all done. We'll start stock in January. Selling stuff. And then.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Yeah, yeah. And then there will be grants.
I'll pass it around in the other days.
And you are on my list of two going to do some on a Sunday. Right. Let me just, I'll ask which day he can have off. Okay. And then, one person to put together that, yeah, can we just, whatever it is, schedule Sundays, we'll pull it and
divided by how many people.
Okay.
Our job is.
I'll try to get online.
Okay. We're in a big spot.
There.
Get out of here.
Oh,
I saw your. I saw it on the RCP.
Did I say that?
So, 26.
We'll try to do that.
Figure something out. Pardon me? Go a little more to the middle.
I'm gonna sit here.
I think it is. Considering.
I know, it's awesome.
Like this might be your Bible. Nope, no, different one. Thank you. Because there's a box of them if you need them.
You know what, you don't even use
Oh, there's a box on the side.
You do? No, you're good.
So it's just right?
Okay, I think we'll get started. Here's the sign up sheet, and I was waiting for everybody to have it. I just kids' names and your grade, and send it up and down. Fill in from the back. First people in the room took the back row, we're just kind of working our way.
It's us, we're here.
Yep, well, no, everybody in the back. It's okay. Good, we're here, how many of you guys worked on the video with Danica for the Christmas service? Just you? Did you as well? Oh, Aiden, you did? Okay, I thought it was senior high kids. I just saw it this afternoon, it's awesome. At the 4 o'clock Christmas service, it's like, how would you describe it? Like the Christmas story on social media or something?
Like the modern.
Modern Christmas story, it's really clever. So it is going to be used during the 4 o'clock service, the Christmas service that the contemporary worship team leads. And then after that, we'll put it on Facebook and our webpage. So make sure you watch it. It's really very, very clever. Very well filmed and well put together too, guys. So good job. Good. Thank you for being here tonight in this kind of last of our class type things that we try and get in before Christmas here. So thank you so much for being here. Tonight we're going to be talking about parables. And I'm going to tell you some stories, and then I'm going to have you kind of in some small discussion groups. You don't have to do any writing or anything. I mean, do you want to close that door? Do you want to, yeah, I don't know. Might get hot in here. Then just
Matthew Riley, over here. Remember to make things?
Let's begin with prayer. Good and loving God, we thank you for this day and for the blessings of this season. And I ask that for all those who are in school, some may be approaching finals, that you would be with students and teachers in this time of year. And I pray for those who will be traveling, all those things going on. Help us, though, to stay focused, Lord, that in this world that has so many needs right now, that we would be able to turn our hearts and turn our minds to the peace and the hope that you bring into our world. So tonight, be with us. I thank you for each of the students and parents who took their time to be here tonight. Be with us as we talk about your word in our lives. In Jesus' name, amen. I'm going to tell you a little story that you may have heard. It's in a book I read, and then I'm going to ask you some questions about it, okay? This is a young teenage girl who was brought up on a cherry orchard, which in Michigan they raise a lot of cherries, just north of Traverse City, Michigan. Her parents were a bit old-fashioned, tended to overreact to her nose ring and the music she listened to. One night, after an argument with her dad, she screamed at him, "I hate you." She ran to her room and decided to act on a plan that she'd rehearsed mentally dozens of times. She ran away. She took a bus to Detroit, thinking her parents would never find her in a big city like that. Her second day there, a man in a big car picks her up, buys her lunch, arranges a place for her to stay, and gives her some pills that make her feel better than she's ever felt before. She decides her parents were wrong and she was right all along. They've been keeping her from all the fun. Well, her good life continues for a month, 2 months, a year. She has a brief scare when she sees her picture printed on the back of a milk carton with the headline, "Have you seen this child?" But she's dyed her hair, wears lots of makeup, and no one would take her for the child in that picture. She's selling herself at night, but she's living in a fancy apartment, and the man she now calls boss is taking care of her. She thinks back on her parents, and that boring life seems a million miles away. However, by the end of that year, the first signs of illness appear, and the boss kicks her out, back onto the streets. She's lost a lot of weight, she's addicted to drugs. Winter comes and she finds herself sleeping on metal grates outside of stores, trying to catch some warmth. One night she's lying there and she begins to feel like a little girl again, and she starts to whimper. She's hungry, she needs a fix. Then suddenly an image came into her mind from the past. Spring in Traverse City. She's throwing a tennis ball with her golden retriever as he dashes between the rows of cherry trees. She's sobbing now. She realizes that more than anything in the world, she wants to go back home. She musters up the courage and calls her house. No answer. 3 more times she calls. No answer. Finally, she leaves a message on the machine. "Dad, Mom, it's me. I was wondering about maybe coming home. I'm catching a bus tomorrow that goes through Traverse City at midnight. If you're not there, I'll just stay on the bus." It takes about 7 hours for a bus to go from Detroit to Traverse City, and during that time she thinks, what if my parents are out of town and never got my message? Maybe I should have talked to them in person, given them some time to overcome the shock. They'd probably written me off as dead. But then she thinks, maybe they'll be there. Please, let them be there. And she rehearses her speech. "Dad, I'm so sorry. I was wrong. It's all my fault. Can you forgive me?" Through the thick snow, she sees the sign, "Welcome to Traverse City," and her stomach lurches. The bus pulls in the station and the driver says, 15 minutes, folks, that's all we have here. 15 minutes to decide her life. She looks at her face in a compact mirror, wipes the lipstick off, and wonders if her parents will notice the yellow stains on her fingers. That is, if they're there. She walks into the terminal not knowing what to expect. Not one of the 1,000 scenes that have played out in her mind prepare her for what she sees. There in the midst of the concrete walls and plastic chairs of that bus terminal stood a group of 40. Brothers and sisters, great aunts, uncles and cousins, her grandma and a great-grandma to boot. They're all wearing goofy party hats and blowing noisemakers, and taped across the entire wall of the terminal is a computer banner that reads, "Welcome home." You know this story? What's the name of it? This was speaking of modern day versions of the Christmas story.
I can't think of it, but I know where you're going.
Yeah, anybody know the name of this Bible story?
The prodigal son.
Yeah. We got the prodigal daughter here, right? What does prodigal mean? Kind of a weird word, we don't use it very much. It means kind of wasteful, someone who just lives maybe extravagantly and, blows their money. The prodigal daughter story. Tonight I said we're talking about parables, and Jesus was a master storyteller. Jesus didn't preach sermons. Jesus told stories. And often they were stories that had a kind of ending. Like when I was reading this story thinking, wow, crap, how's this going to end? Doesn't sound like it's going to end well, right? It does end well. And that's kind of the cool thing about parables. They're stories that kind of go, just twist at the ending, because Jesus knew his audience and he was often trying to make a little jab, make a little point. Most parables have what I call surprise endings. They're like, really? Huh? Didn't think it was going to turn out like that. And that's really what a parable is. And my favorite chapter, some of you have heard me say this before, my favorite chapter in the Bible is the 15th chapter of Luke, because that's where this story comes from. And there's two other parables in that little short chapter. There's 3 stories in a row. The lost son, or the prodigal son. Anybody else know? There's 2 other lost stories. The lost coin, good. Okay, the lost coin. Do you know what that story is? Remember that one? This lady loses like a nickel, right? And she's freaking out. She goes all over. She looks under the couch cushion. She goes under the rug. Finally, she carries all of her furniture out into her front yard, sweeps the floor, finds the darn nickel, runs outside, hooting and hollering, calls all the neighbors over to throw a party because she found her nickel. What would you think about that neighbor? Goofy, right? Who is the old lady in that story? Come on, it's the right answer in all the children's sermons. Yeah, okay, the old lady is God, and who's the nickel? You! You're the nickel. We think this person's crazy because we're lost and the old lady goes crazy looking for this darn nickel. And the good news is, you're the nickel. So the story is great news because we're the nickel and God just goes crazy to find us. Right? So we got the lost coin, the lost, oops. What is it? What's the rest of the word? Sheep. The lost sheep. And what's the story of the lost sheep? Just give me in one sentence what happens. You guys know this from Sunday school?
Is lost.
Huh?
One sheep is lost.
One sheep is lost. How many were there?
99.
There were 100 and then there were 99, right? Wasn't this just in the video on Sunday? Oh, that was the bad sheep. No, okay. Yeah, really cute video on Sunday. Okay, 100 sheep, and what does the shepherd do? Goes off looking for the one darn sheep. And God is the shepherd, and who's the sheep? The lost one, or are you the 99 that stayed there and acted really good? Yeah. You know, so there are days maybe when we can count ourselves lucky in the 99, but I think all of us are pretty good at being the one lost sheep too. And so these stories of being lost, I think it's why I love it so much, because they're just pure good news stories, aren't they? That we mess up and God keeps loving us. and we go off to the far country and blow all of our money and do all this stupid stuff, and God throws a welcome home party. Is God, let me ask you, is God fair? Is that fair? Huh? I don't think it's very fair. In fact, it ticks me off. Let me remind you of the story of the prodigal son, and I actually brought this in here. Can you see this? Because I thought we had a painting of the prodigal son somewhere, and then I came out and it's a statue. So this is the father and this is the son. So I'm going to remind you of the story, and then I'm going to ask you some questions about the prodigal son, okay? The story of the prodigal son, remember it's a man, and he has a big younger brother and an older brother, right? Okay, and the younger brother comes and says, Dad, when you're dead, I'm going to get half the money, so can I have it now? Well, not a very nice question, but the dad surprisingly says, yeah, okay, here. So the son takes it, goes down to Hennepin Avenue, whatever, just starts going to all the clubs, visiting prostitutes, spending all his money doing stupid stuff, and pretty soon is sleeping on the streets, kind of this story that I just read, right? And so after a while he decides to come home, and maybe his dad, he's like, well, maybe my dad will just let me work on the farm. Meanwhile, what's the big brother doing, the older brother?
He's responsible.
Yeah, well, he's responsible, okay, doing the heavy lifting. He stayed home, maybe not really good attitude, but he's home working, right? So the son comes home, and this is this scene in the statue, which is one of the best scenes, I think, in the whole Bible, because the son comes walking home, and he's just like, he doesn't know if the dad's going to accept him, right? The dad's sitting on the porch swing on the front porch, sees off in the distance, and goes, that's my son who left. And the dad gets up, and I'll tell you why this is cool in just a second. The dad doesn't kind of go, well, you're back. Like that. The dad, what does the dad do? Here's the cool next word is the dad runs. The dad runs down the road to his son, and the son, as you can see, kind of in the statue, just collapses in the dad's arms, and the dad says, welcome home, throws him a party, and we think the story's over, but before the curtain goes down, we get one glimpse of the older brother. What's he doing? Huh?
Working.
He's working. How's he feeling about now?
Resentful.
No kidding. A little ticked off. How many of you are firstborn children? Raise your hand. Are you feeling a little ticked off by that story?
You get all the new clothes.
What? But you get all the new clothes. Okay, all right. Well, Yeah, no, I, for a long time, identified, with the older brother kind of ticked off that, if you stay home and you kind of think you're doing the right thing, and the older I got, the more I realized, I think probably most of us are the younger son. It's kind of like the lost sheep, and the lost messed up everything. It's like, oh, yeah, okay, that's me. And so the prodigal story ends with the older brother looking probably into the barn where the party's going on, and the curtain goes down, and the older brother's just kind of standing there. So there's no real ending to this story, so I'm going to have you talk about that in a few minutes, how this story might have ended. But before we do that in little small groups, I read something that I thought was kind of interesting, just culturally, about this story of the prodigal son, because these stories mean something different in different parts of the world. And so this Lutheran professor went around and told the story of the prodigal son in Africa and in South America and in the Middle East, and said, tell me what's interesting to you. What do you hear in this story? So I'm just going to share this with you because I think it's kind of fascinating. So now I just told you the story. You got the whole picture in your head. The people in the Middle East said, to ask your dad for your inheritance is like so wrong, so horrible. It's like saying, Dad, I wish you were dead. Can I have the money? Right? I mean, you all kind of laughed when I said that. I mean, that in the Middle Eastern culture, that would be a horrendous thing to do. And this story, Jesus was in the Middle East. Okay, so this was pretty radical that the son did it, and pretty radical that the dad said, yeah, sure, here's your money. There's a Jewish law in the book of Deuteronomy that says you can put to death a rebellious son. So again, that's part of the culture behind this story. And then, do you remember what the son did? What job did he end up doing where he finally just said, I've had it? Do you remember? Yep.
Took care of the pigs.
He was feeding the pigs. Think about this for a Jew. Is that a good job? Feeding the pigs? That's the rock bottom job, okay? So there's all kinds of little things in this story where they just said, you know, that's how they heard this. That this story would have evoked horror and disgust. Then in Latin America, where over half of the population lives below the poverty level, they said, they identified with the younger son and said this guy had no money and he had a crappy job. And they were hearing it more as the younger son. And they also said the father's love isn't really fair, but the father's love was gracious. And so there was more understanding of, they were looking for fairness, and they said, you know, this isn't fair, but wow, it's incredibly, this father's love is gracious. And then the African one, and I really identified with this because this is so true, and you've maybe heard us talk about this with our visits in Tanzania, where the people are so generous and hospitable. And you know that saying, it takes a village to raise a child? That comes out of Africa, because there the village raises the child. I mean, in America, we're kind of like each person for themselves. They think more as a village, more communally. And so when they heard this story, they said, why did no one give the young man food? He was hungry and he was walking around. They couldn't get why the community, the village, didn't give this hungry man food. And they did not blame one person, they blamed the whole community, because they said the village failed the younger son, the fact that he was hungry. And then it's interesting, when this is translated into African languages, you know, when I said that he came home and the father threw the younger son a party, in Swahili, one of the languages in Africa, it says when he came home, the village threw him a party. So the younger son is reconciled not only to his father, but to the whole village, because he had broken from the village and then the village received him home. So I mean, it doesn't change the meaning of any of these stories, but it just makes me realize that that God's word, as it's shared in different cultures, that people hear it, hear different things from that. So what I want you to do, I'm going to have you do this 2 times in the next little chunk of time we have here. So pass this around. And you know what, let me take a chunk of it. Oops, just, you need one. There's the parable of the prodigal son on one side and the parable of the Good Samaritan on the other. So I'm going to have you turn to one other family group near you. So just turn your chairs. You're going to be in this group for 5 minutes. And there's 3 questions. Okay, so one of the parents kind of take charge as make sure the kids, I want both kids in the group to answer all the questions. Okay, small groups of 2 or 3 kids with your parents. You have 5 minutes on only the prodigal son story. Okay?
No bill?
Are there enough copies? Eric, I have one.
Bill's an 8th grade, goes to Minnesota.
Guys in 8th grade, goes
Are those extras in? Yeah. Oh.
You identify with the younger brother?
Are we choosing them?
I'm not sure if I identify as either one
Do you have a choice or preference in your story? Sorry.
a lot better at saving money than me. The older stuff, I always thought it was kind of a story about Christianity. The younger son is the younger brother is the one from back.
So you both identify with the United States Army?
No, I identify with one.
Oh, you left.
Because I
identify with the other one.
But I think it's good.
Well, I am the oldest out of three brothers, and so, you know, just like
No.
it's something different if I was an only child.
Fair.
Older one's the one that actually
Except the son back in
Real incentive.
Did more work, and he should like grow. I guess he doesn't have a reason to grow further. So I guess I'm actually did the right thing because he didn't have a reason to grow a party for the younger son, the older son. Like had a reason to grow a party for the older son.
I don't think you should give a fine. I'm with I guess if he's fine, if it's to do it.
But I think they use the word fair.
But I'm not just like, oh, actually, that's money.
Fair.
I'm not gonna, like, he left until.
And then came back home, so I wanted to be the son
I
again.
either like not care,
Probably
or
didn't
care
care
a lot.
about
I think like if they ran away or whatever, I think it's kind of bad as well, not like the right way, like just like you have to be like, you're the one that's running here, not to run away with him, and that one, I started to push my son in that class, not when I should be. So I think
Really good point. Share your stuff with him.
I think I would get really mad well, I don't have a reason to grow a party for you. I have a reason to grow a party for your son. Your older brother. So if I have a reason to grow a party for you, I will. I think well, I guess you might well, good luck getting money.
Please, one more minute.
I think that'd be hard. I mean, you, as a parent, you would always, I always welcome back your child, because it's really hard to turn your back. Difficult it is.
You guys are too
And then it also depends, like, when I ran away for a couple days, like, it's been like 20 years, and like,
Well, or if you just let all that
Does he want to
stuff
pull back into your,
well, I'm not a parent, so.
someday you might feel different.
Yeah, like, I just don't have that feeling right now.
Okay, I want to just, I'm kind of curious, so I'm just going to ask some larger questions. How many of you said I identify more with the younger brother? Really? And the rest of you said older brother? Did you really?
said sort of a combination of the two.
Combo of two, depends on the day or?
The middle child.
The middle child. Okay. Somebody give me an ending to the story that you think, what might have happened if the curtain went back up and the older brother was standing there. Finish the story, because this story doesn't really have an ending, and I always want to know how the older brother ended up. Anybody have any ideas? Phil?
I think the older brother said, you know, he left a note for his dad. He hopped the next caravan going to the city. And he came back 5 years later and said, okay, I'm ready to go back now. Don't throw a party. I just had to get away.
get away from the younger brother and the dad.
The whole family set up, he just had to walk away.
Just had it for a while. Sounds pretty possible, right?
Seen it happen before.
You know, there's a lot of stories like this in all of our families. And that's why I think, you know, Jesus' parables are kind of like this and then twist. They kind of, some of them really get us right here because we can relate, right? And we all have taken different roles in that story. Anybody else have an idea on how the older brother handled this? Yep.
I think if the father had shown so much love towards the prodigal son, I envision the story going that, okay, the party starts or whatever, and the father reaches back out to the working son and saying, hey, this is why I did this. You have served a different component of our family and whatever. I love you both, and this is why I did it.
Exactly, right? I mean, the father continued to love the older son. Right? I mean, there's no reason to think that all of a sudden the younger son's the favorite, right? So what does this mean kind of for us? Because, I think there are church people, somewhere, not here, who kind of think, well, yeah, God probably loves me. Well, here's where I see this. When, sometimes around funerals, when, a wonderful, beloved grandparent dies, and people will say, I know God, loved my grandma so much, she was so good, she was kind of the older brother, right? I mean, they don't say that, but that, so this person did all the right stuff in his or her life. So they're in, they're good. Mm-hmm. And what does this story say? They are in, they're good, right? But what about the rest of us? Are we in and good?
We're in too.
What? We're in too. We're in too. But here's the thing. The younger son turned around and came home. There's a turning there, right? So the younger son did turn and return, right? And then the dad's standing there with open arms, right? So, I mean, these are just such beautiful stories on who God is. And I think it's important for us to remember, especially if we kind of think we're the older brother, we don't got any special in here because God kind of loves everybody. And that's, the next parable we're going to talk about is another great example of that where Jesus kind of throws it in the face of the Jews who kind of thought, we're the best. We're the chosen ones. We got all the right stuff going for us. And Jesus tells stories, and I'm sure at the end of the next story I'm going to tell you, the audience gasped. Because it's like, wait a minute, that's not how that was supposed to end. So I want you to name a few other parables that you can think of. Anybody think of any other these little stories that Jesus tells in the Bible that kind of have a moral to them or a surprise ending? Anybody think of any others? I'll give you a clue. Jen and the confirmands, our 10th graders, acted one out on Confirmation Sunday about a month ago. Is anybody here? Remember that day? They did a big skit and they had on hard hats. Right? It's the parable of the laborers in the vineyard. So let me refresh your memory. A guy needed workers out in his field. People were hanging out in the town square. He came and got a bunch of people at 8 in the morning. They went out and started working. Went back at noon, got some more people. They started working. Went back at 3 o'clock, got those people. They started working. Like 4:45, he brings out another group of people in the field. 5 o'clock, the bell rings. What does the guy say? I'm going to pay all of you $20. Well, again, is that fair? No. So what's that story about? It's not dissimilar from the younger brother and older brother, right? Doesn't matter when you come in or how hard you work. God's like, you know what? I just love all of you. So it's not this fair, but it's not fair. And that kind of ticks us off, and that kind of ticked the Jewish people off who are listening to all these stories of how loving and unfair and gracious God is. The Good Samaritan, isn't there a parable about some seeds? Anybody remember that? The sower threw seeds, the cracks in the sidewalk, and where did the seeds grow? In the good soil, and they got scattered on the rocks. Did they grow there? No, the seeds are supposed to be planted in the good soil, right? Okay, so that's the sower and the seeds. Do you remember a story, a parable, about this guy who was going to this rich guy who was going to throw a big Christmas party? Not Christmas party, but and so, put on a huge spread, got a band, and, fine linen tablecloths, all this great food and drinks, and nobody showed. All his rich friends kind of, blew him off, decided they had something better to do. So what did this guy do? Do you remember?
He went out and collected all the poor and cast off.
Yeah, he went driving around, picked up the guy who's on the freeway entrance ramp, and picked up the kid who didn't have a place to sleep that night, went over to the shelter and said, come on, hop on the bus. Brought them all back. They all sit down at these fine tablecloths with this great meal, and then he looks over at the band, and you know what they start playing? Amazing Grace. And he goes, do you get it? I mean, that's kind of the end of the story. It's like, wait a minute, what were those guys doing at the party? And as I walked into our community meal, this happens every week, but tonight, because I was thinking about this story, and I walked in there, and it was all set with nice tablecloths, and the community meal people had made a nice Christmas dinner, and I looked around our gym, and I thought, that's a heavenly feast. That's the people where it doesn't really matter who shows up, right? It's the lost sheep, and it's the lost coins, and it's the older brothers, and the big brothers, and the old ladies from Aquila Commons, and the lady who just got out of the hospital last week sitting there by herself, and an old man in some goofy hat, and the ECC families, and the church staff, and the choir members. And I look around, and that to me is a picture of this feast in the kingdom, right? And everybody's welcome, and it doesn't matter where you came from or who you are. And that's, I hope, you guys, especially you, confirmation kids, how you see this church all the time. We try to be that kind of place, right? So that's a great story. The last story I'm going to tell you is the Good Samaritan. What's a Samaritan? Anybody know anything about a Samaritan? Good guy, bad guy? Good guy. Well, he's kind of the hero of the story, but here's where the little knife gets stuck in. Okay, so a rich lawyer, a Jewish lawyer, comes up to Jesus and he says, so Jesus, who's my neighbor? I'm supposed to love my neighbor. Who's my neighbor? And Jesus goes, it's where Jesus bursts into a story. So there's all these Jews standing around, people like lawyers and such. And the Samaritan, I'm just going to tell you this in advance. Okay, so here's a country. Right under that country is the country of Samaria. And right under that's where Israel, where all the Jews are, where this is happening, okay? So if the Jews are going from up here to down here and Samaria's in between, they go, They don't even walk through the country. If Samaritans touched food, they wouldn't touch it. The Samaritans are unclean, nasty, filthy people, in their eyes, that they didn't want to associate with, okay? Those are the Samaritans. So they're the bad guys to the Jews. So Jesus tells this story, and kind of the punchline is, who's the hero? The Good Samaritan. That's where everybody kind of goes, oh, what? No, not them, okay? So the guy's beat up by the side of the road, right? Police come by, whatever. The police go, body by the side of the road, what do you know? And then the youth group walks by on their way to do something Danica asked them to do, and they're like, oh yeah, body on the side of the road. pastors walk by, especially Jason, he goes by and side of the road. Okay, no. So, I mean, you see, they're kind of like the people who you think might do something about it. And then the Samaritan, the dirty, filthy, no good Samaritan, comes by and doesn't just like wrap this guy's wounds, puts him on his donkey or whatever, hauls him to the nearest hotel, pays for his room that night, tells the hotel manager, give him food and whatever he needs and I'll come back and pay for the rest of it. So, who the hero of the story is the Samaritan. And I'm sure the Jews listened to that and thought, right, you know? Who do you think, if we told that story today, who might the Samaritan be if we put that story in modern day terms? Who might be the person that you kind of go, huh? Who might Jesus kind of needle us and say, yeah, you thought you were better than that person? Well, you aren't. Anybody want to risk? I mean, there's no right or wrong answer. I'm just saying, if this story happened today, who would the hero? Who's the good Samaritan? Yep.
Like maybe like a homeless person.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a good guess. Like this scruffy looking maybe person walks by and you think, oh, they're not going to help. Good. Who else might it be?
Maybe a Muslim.
I was thinking about that. I'm telling the story and they say a woman in a hijab comes walking by. Really? She stopped and helped. Mm-hmm. Isn't it interesting who God uses? You know, we kind of think, oh, God uses us or people like us, right? God uses everybody. And I think the Jewish mucky-mucks who were being told this story thought God, you know, used them. And this is such a great story because it's no, God uses, you know. And another person that came to my mind is like an undocumented immigrant from Mexico, you know. I mean, people who we sometimes do not think the way we should about. And we all have hearts that God made, and we're all the same. And like I said, God uses all of us as Samaritans. Did you know there's a law, actually a national law, called the Good Samaritan Law? So that this is a parable. It's interesting that that gets people kind of know this story a little bit. The Good Samaritan Law is that if you see, for example, a body by the side of the road, you are obligated to stop and do something about it. All of us are obligated to be Good Samaritans, and that's actually a legally enforceable thing, which I think is interesting. And by the way, I'll tell all of you, because this time of year is an important time to lift up this fund. We have a fund here at church called the Good Samaritan Fund that our foundation has, that this time of year especially, people will come in and say, I can't buy my family Christmas gifts. And so we tap into the Good Samaritan Fund, where and it's just money that people throw in and refurnish, which is kind of a cool Christmas gift idea if you're not buying the cows and pigs and that thing that we talked about last Sunday. It's a really nice way to put money in a pot that gets used for people who need it. So I just want you to know that that's something that is supported here at church, this Good Samaritan Fund. So what I want you to do now for 5 minutes, again, is flip your sheet over where it says the parable of the Good Samaritan. And there's 3 questions, and I want you to turn the opposite direction you turned before, if you can, and talk to somebody different, if that works where you're sitting. If it doesn't, that's okay. Okay, 5 minutes, those 3 questions on the Good Samaritan.
Josh?
I would be the hero.
Unless you can talk about that.
Do you have any other ideas for
Well, famous people that have a reputation of being.
Yeah, somebody that you would expect.
Truthfully, what do you think you might do if you saw a person lying on the side of the road? What questions or concerns would run through your head?
Are they okay?
But it is a culture, I can
Like, if it's going somewhere,
have a job, you know what I'm saying?
when do I have to be at my job?
Areas of grease.
But again,
I was just wondering about that.
Make sure I have this amount of our neighbors, quite a lot here. My neighbors, what do you think? The lunch we're doing, this lunch, if someone asked me, who is your neighbor? How would you answer that question? Explain your answer. I would say, everyone, we're all on the same page. Well, like, everyone is Jewish, because we're all in it.
I think that's the question, is what do you think of
very good friends. Have that really well.
I think it's a real Here it could mean different.
Our friends are there, and they that person on the
Yeah, but that's what they do.
Okay, 1 minute.
I realize they're like, oh my and you know, part of it is like,
All right, you want to pull back into the large room or just the last
for the,
Did the attendance sheet get all the way around? No. Where did it stall out? Everybody on this side? Just didn't go over here. Okay. So kind of quickly make sure, because we just have a few minutes left. Okay. I'm curious about the last question there, because as I said, I hope you when you hear the word neighbor, you think, wow, I hear that word a lot at church, because we do talk about our neighbor. And last winter, I know some of you came to the My Neighbor is Muslim series, and the word neighbor was used very intentionally last year as we did that really great series where we formed some really nice relationships with the imam and some folks from his mosque. This Lent, as I put on there, we're doing My Neighbor is Jewish, which in St. Louis Park and Hopkins, our neighbors are Jewish, so they are Muslim as well, but I think it's important for us to understand the traditions of, especially the synagogues that really surround us right here. And we have a rabbi coming to teach on Sunday mornings between services. And we're going to do some very interesting things both on Sunday morning and at the Wednesday night Lent services, so that'll be during Lent. And we do have a few spots left, and we're taking a trip during Spring Break Week, which is Holy Week this year, from the beginning of the week, from Sunday to Wednesday, to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. And I have, I think, about 4 tickets left that I got before that's full. We have about 20-some people signed up. So just so you know, that's a Westwood U course that you'll be able to take during Lent, and I highly recommend it. So will any of you be willing to share with me, how did you answer that question? Who is my neighbor? Because that was really the origin of this whole parable. Somebody said, by the way, who is my neighbor? What did you say? Yep.
The person that lives right next to me.
Okay, that's one, and it doesn't matter who that person is, right? Okay. What else? Who else is it?
Your family?
Your family's your neighbor? Yeah. How about, yep.
Everyone.
Everybody? You really mean it? Yeah. Right. You know, I mean, I think we try to have partnerships with people in different parts of our city here. We have partnerships with people in different parts of the world. A partnership we didn't even know about, maybe some of you heard a few weeks ago, we baptized a girl from our congregation who's married, had a baby up in Alaska, lives out in the bush in a town that has no roads going into it. You only fly into it, this little bush town, and their church hasn't had a pastor for like 3 years, and they listen to our worship services online every week. And this girl, Maddie, said, it's really funny to hear everybody talk about, oh yeah, Pastor Jason's preaching today, and so on. I mean, she said they feel like they know all of us. And so the day we baptized the baby, I had everybody turn around and say hi to the congregation in Bethel, Alaska. It's a little Lutheran church, and the secretary actually emailed me and said, yeah, we can't tell you how much that meant. She said we worship about 15 people, and the fact that we all kind of said, you know, hi, those are our neighbors. Bottom line point of the story, we didn't even know they're part of our family. They're part of our church family that we didn't even know. So our neighbors are people we don't even know, but people that we share something with in this case. So that's pretty cool. So bottom line on the parables are a cool storytelling way that Jesus used to show us that God has a different view of the world than we do. And it's a pretty awesome view. It's a pretty loving view. It's not always a fair view, but it's a very gracious view of us and our neighbors and the world. And these parables are just, I think, kind of a fun little piece in the Bible that Jesus uses to say, things aren't always just the way you think they are, or what we hear on TV or from our friends. God has a view of things that kind of challenges our point of view. So I hope you heard that a little bit in the stories tonight. Good. Thank you. Go in peace, serve the Lord. Have a good rest of Advent.
It's nice to
You too.
My neighbor is
Ready for Christmas? Nothing, right?
Your countdown going?
Yeah, I think we'll be there, we'll get back on Christmas Eve here. Okay, cool. But yeah, we'll be on
I
there.
think we're just going
We gotta get down there, make sure it's not like flooding. Yeah, that's what I want to, so. Yeah, we'll be there.
Is that a white hat?
22nd, I guess.
It is.
Ooh, it's warm in here.
Yeah.